So there's some new demographic data that's been dropped by the Office of National Statistics, and it turns out, yet again, we're in a total nightmare. So if we look at here, we've got the ONS data for England and Wales. This has just been released on the 17th of August 2023. This was for 2022. In England and Wales, the number of live births to UK-born women, so that's the native population, but that's not even broken down by ethnicity as well. So the numbers are getting fudged a little bit. Decreased from 445,055 in 2021 to 422,109 in 2022. So that's about a 23,000 person drop. 22, 23. And so in England and Wales, 30.3% of all live births were to non UK born mothers. So a third, almost a third, of all births are to immigrant populations in the UK. So we can see the demographic chart shifting more towards the new, diverse Britons rather than the people that have nowhere else to go. This is up from 28.8, so that's a near 2% jump, continuing the long-term trend of the percentage of live births to non-UK mothers generally increasing. In 2022, turns out that India for women and Pakistan for men were the most common countries of motherhood and fatherhood. So we're seeing a subcontinental resurgence. It turns out that we're being reverse colonized, I suppose. In 2022, two-thirds of live births in London occurred to parents where either one or both parents were born outside the UK. And so we've got some charts here. But Migration Watch ended up calculating that the domestic birth rate from the raw numbers is 1.494. Now, that's not broken down by ethnicity. So we can only assume that the numbers are being bumped up by India, Pakistan, Romania, and the like. And so the domestic birth rate for British women is much, much lower than that. Reminder, replacement birth rate is 2.1. So we are about 6 points and counting below replacement birth rate. So we've got reality on two TV screens here, right? It was first it's not happening, now it's apparently a good thing. UK birth slump dubbed good for the planet as number of babies born hits 20-year
This
low.
is nonsense.
Yep, I knew I
Uh,
wanted to annoy you with antinatalism.
yeah, no, this is absolute nonsense. You know what I get pissed off with the carbon footprint
Yes.
because they constantly say that people babies that are born in the West and people in the West they have carbon footprint, high carbon footprints, and we need to decrease, let's say, our carbon emissions. And actually, their way of doing it is calling for the reduction of the population in Western countries and they claim that it's a good thing. So it's not any conspiracy or something. It's an actual title. But on the other hand, they forget that this is actually the way you live. Let's say even if we agree on the concept of carbon footprint and we posit momentarily that it makes sense, the population that will migrate into Western societies will still live in the same way.
Well, their birth rates are also going down, as is sub-Saharan Africa's. So they're the only ones that are still above replacement, but they're losing one child every 15 years as well. So globally, the entire trend is going down. This is why, as I'll get onto shortly, mass migration is not just a problem for scarce resources, the housing market, cultural deracination. It's also not a long-term projected fix for this either. And as I spoke to Stephen Shaw about this, he looked into the data about this carbon footprint stuff. It's funny, the graphs. First of all, most of this data is collected by Paul Ehrlich's Zero Population Growth Company, NGO, whatever the hell it is called, which have now rebranded themselves to ZPG because it looks really bad to say zero population growth. And they found that they don't account for the more efficient use of energy and resources that accrue over time with human development. So actually, carbon footprint per person goes down. Whether or not carbon footprint is actually a problem as well is never questioned, but hey ho. And also, their graphs only start at a specific point and then end at a specific point, not accounting for the fact that birth rates are naturally dropping anyway. Again, bad thing, but I suppose it's not a bad thing if you just want less white people, as this woman seems to be. So in this article, it says Britain's top demographics expert, clearly not if she has this opinion, Sarah Harper, and she's got CBE as well, so she's regime endorsed, the founder and director of the Oxford Institute for Population Aging and a former government advisor, said falling birth rates in the West were good for our planet. Professor Harper told The Telegraph, I think it's a good thing that the high income, high consuming countries of the world are reducing the number of children they're having. I'm quite positive about that. The academic said declining fertility in rich countries would help to address the general overconsumption that we have at the moment, which has a negative impact of the planet. Now, I agree, consumerism is very bad. It's also bad just because it dumps microplastics in our oceans and makes us really ill. But that doesn't mean that we should be the carbon this woman wants to reduce.
Let me just say, because I like looking at how people use language, it's sort of a hobby. The planet has no welfare. I really think it's really ridiculous when people say good for a planet,
Yeah, who's going to inherit
rather
said
than, for
planet?
instance, saying something like good for the system that sustains human life. But they cannot say the latter because they're antinatalists
And they
frequently.
fundamentally hate humans. Yeah, they're misanthropes. Absolutely. So, speaking of the quality and replacement, this is the next TV screen that we're watching instead, and it's also in the Telegraph. So, Telegraph is pretty good these days. This is an article that says the ONS actually didn't calculate the fertility rate in the latest release of the data, as the numbers I already said that Migration Watch had looked at. He said it has a fertility rate of 1.62 per woman. So he's got a bit more of an optimistic bent by about a percentage point, but that's not great. And the live birth rate was 55.8 per thousand women. And according to the World Bank, the fertility rate in sub-Saharan Africa and other low-income countries is 4.6 per woman. In a high-income country, by contrast, it averages at 1.5. So Britain is sitting right on the benchmark of population collapse for high-income countries. So just bring the entire third world in and problem solved, right? Well, it used to be more fashionable to argue that higher levels of immigration were good for productivity and therefore more than paid for themselves. That may have once been true. Think of the Huguenots, this guy says, because that's as far back as we have to go to think about the one time we had mass immigration from our neighbor France, which were pretty ethnically and culturally quite similar and aren't just a bunch of Moroccans. But that's fine. Despite the declining birth rate, the UK's population has risen by nearly 10 million since the turn of the century. But productivity effectively stopped growing 15 years ago, a hiatus of almost unprecedented longevity. So, turns out that people aren't just Homo economicus, and you can't just transplant them from one time, place, and culture into another, and they're equally as effective and well adapted to a certain set of of economic and cultural conditions. Because it turns out that these people just want to sit in hotels and smoke all day. So, yeah, not quite the solution we thought of. Also, if you look into the care home statistics from a survey the WHO said, because apparently we need to import a bunch of Africans to care for our elderly, 1 in 3 of them admitted to abusing patients. So I don't want to be looked after by them. I'd rather be looked after by my own kids. Not just the reason to have
One in
kids,
three.
but 1 in 3 admitted to abusing a patient. Yeah, that's on the WHO's own website.
It's disgusting.
Yeah, which is why the Japanese are now doing robots to look after their elderly. But that's going to be equally alienating. You're going to end up in San Junipero or something. So, not a solution currently or in the future. So, speaking of the future, we've got an image of that. I've referenced this article before in a discussion with Carl. This is Japan. So, Japan, as of last year, the country's population plummeted by almost a million. It's because so many young people are not actually having children. In 2022, Japan saw a mere 771,000 births. And this is the first time the number fell below 800,000 since the records began back in 1899. So that's a 200-year trend that's been broken. The Prime Minister, so Fumio Kishida, is extremely worried. Our nation, he declared, is on the cusp of whether or not it can maintain its societal functions. So we have a few forks in the road here. Could go down the route of mass immigration, which destroys the housing market and public services and makes everything more expensive and destroys culture and makes it feel like the people who were never asked whether or not they'd like to be demographically replaced no longer recognize the world on our doorstep. Mm,
Even if they are asked
Yeah.
and they say no,
Yes.
it goes forth.
Exactly, yeah. So they're majorly subverted by the government that said, actually, we're going to get Brexit done and lower immigration. Now we've got record immigration. Thanks for the million plus visas, Boris and the rest of the Conservative Party. Or we have the opposite, which could be economic restructure to enable more families, right? So what are Japan doing? Well, we've got this article in the New York Times. Can shrinking be good for Japan? A Marxist bestseller makes the case. Now,
Well, I mean, out of all the literature you could, you read in order to gain insights for how to structure an economy, you picked Marxism. Just
yeah,
not prudent.
no. So what I think happens in this particular article is that he diagnoses plenty of the problems with the wrong economic heuristic, but plenty of the problems, and provides the wrong solution. And what he calls degrowth is cringe. But I will make the conservative case for degrowth later. Just you wait. So, when Kohei Sato decided to write about degrowth communism, his editor was understandably skeptical. Communism is unpopular in Japan because Japan is sensible. Economic growth is gospel. So, a book arguing that Japan should view its current condition of population decline and economic stagnation not as a crisis, but as an opportunity for Marxist revolution sounded like a tough sell. Thank you, New York Times, for interviewing this obscure communist. So, His book released in 2020 and it's sold 500,000 copies. Japan, the world's third largest economy, has worked for years to promote economic growth in the shadow of an aging, shrinking population, with a monetary and fiscal policy that is among the most aggressive of any nation. But there are strong indications that the country's growth oriented policies of ultra cheap money and big government spending are reaching their limits. Yes, because the big government spending and ultra cheap money are reliant on debt. If the world keeps ballooning its debt, particularly with the dollar as a reserve currency going bankrupt, as Dan has spoken about on Brokenomics multiple times, then the whole thing is going to burst like a bubble and you're going to be left poor again. Not a very sensible strategy. So growth should not be the only goal. The focus on growth is important when Japan was developing. But now the country is wealthy, Mr. Sato said, the insistence on an endlessly expanding economy, described in terms of gross domestic product, has produced obviously wasteful spending as the government has urged people to consume more. And that's pretty based. Pretty true. Yeah. There are too many cars, too many skyscrapers, too many convenience stores, too much fast fashion. Yep, the things that you own end up owning you in Fight Club sense. Reorienting Japan towards goals that more effectively reflect the country's current needs, he said, would mean using metrics other than GDP to gauge the country's economic well-being. The focus would shift from quantity to quality on measures like health, education, and standard of living. Now, I agree in part, but can you see the framing here is still managerial? It's we need to quantify other things and just economic. No, no, stop trying to measure everything on a GDP graph. You shouldn't have your fingers in every pie. We should value things differently on a moral level rather than a metric level.
Yeah,
That's the problem.
we're in agreement. And I think that what is especially managerial about this is the idea of a social engineer.
Yes.
And it is a particular problem that a lot of the people that, for instance, Hayek was arguing against, their mentality is being embraced by the managerial class right now,
Yes.
who have a complete plan for how the economy should be run. And that is why they're making also the labor shortage arguments, because there are some jobs, for instance, that aren't needed anymore.
Yes.
Okay.
And they will be
Yeah.
rendered obsolete by automation, which Japan is leading the way on.
Yes. And actually, Japan is really, I think the Japanese government is really adamant in upholding the Japanese national identity.
Yes.
They don't allow, for instance, lots of economic migrants to stay there for a long time or to migrate with their families. So they're really strict about their immigration policies.
The Yakuza are also basically state sanctioned ethnic gatekeepers, so they kick out other gangs that are running drugs and the like. So even their criminals have a very culturally protectionist element. Which
I don't know about that, but
we'll
I've
be discussing that
heard
on the
they
economic
have
of
a
organized
kind of
crime.
relation to the samurai.
Yeah, they have the same mentality as an honor system. It's
Yeah.
they try and conceive
Let's
themselves as new
keep that
samurai,
for
but
another.
yes. So he says achieving degrowth communism is less about personal choices and more about changing overarching political and economic structures. Marxism, he argues, offers a viable model since bloody when for reorienting society around the maximalization of public goods as opposed to the endless pursuit and concentration of wealth. No, this is why you don't actually understand your own doctrine, my friend, because Marxism shares the same problem as Marx's definition of capitalism, or actually the idea just generally of capitalism, which is the exponential growth of wealth for wealth's sake. It's the generation of abundance. Marx actually aims at the same ideals as a materialist capitalist, which is just making the most economic goods and the most amount of individualism for a person. He just has the wrong way of bringing it about. I think just push that entire paradigm aside and go back to making the family the primary mode of civic participation again.
The family is a prime social unit.
It should absolutely
If
be.
people, I think there's no others. I mean, if people reject the family, then society collapses.
And that's what we're seeing right now, I think. And that's why even Oxfam turned around and said, well, GDP, bit sexist, because you're not treating women like women who can be mothers. You're treating them as individual, fungible unisex consumer units who need to change their biology and mentality to compete in the workforce on behalf of men to generate GDP for GDP's sake. Like, why do we care about making things, a world that's habitable money for if we're not going to impart it
Yeah,
off
they
into the
have
next
it
generation?
backwards,
Yeah, there's no point. And so he says, I'm not saying go back to the Edo period, he said, referencing the feudal era where the country was largely closed to the rest of the world. His vision for the future is one in which people less consumed by their endless pursuit of growth for growth's sake have the leisure time to spend on a workday pursuing new interests as he does with farming. So he's treating subsistence, which was the economic mode before the Industrial Revolution, where you worked to create products for the people immediately in your own household, as a leisure activity. And that's the most, as Marxists would say, bourgeois opinion imaginable. And he admits it because he says right at the end, Mr. Sato laughed, I'm definitely bourgeois. Right, so you're not going to give anything up, are you? You're just like feeding chickens as a LARP. But actually doing it would be noble, but you're not.
Well, apparently he should read the economic, the history of the plague in Europe and actually see the effects it had and how it changed the economic model.
Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't be shocked. And speaking of reading industrial history, if you'd like to subscribe to our website for as little as £5 a month, you can get all of our premium content, like this brand new podcast, which the audio is now fixed. You can go and listen to Evil Origins of Feminism Part 2. I put hell of a lot of work into this one. We had an incredible discussion with Carl for 2 hours, and I mainly focus on Ivan Illich's gender. And if recently I've been using words that a lot of you are scratching your head, like unisex fungible consumer unit, you can understand how my frame of reference has been fundamentally changed by this. And that is that the Industrial Revolution, when it came about, it brought a disjunction in sex relations. People had gender as a culture locked in time and place. Tools were ergonomically shaped to men and women's hands. It was just how we existed. As soon as the Industrial Revolution changed it, and so it meant that machines could be operated by men or by women, it set in motion a series of cultural changes that ended up with the digital and sexual revolutions that commanded men and women change themselves in order to participate in the workforce and generate as much capital equally for the sake of making capital. And so this is the point. This is the flashpoint where feminism came out of. It was an inevitable destruction of the family unit, legitimated by technology. So when people complain, all we need to do is get rid of feminism, the birth rates will go up. No, guys, like the pill was the reason that feminism has become the dominant hegemon. Same with the unisex factory machine and the laptop and all that. What we basically need is a technological change, consciously renouncing some of these things, so we might come back together. So we can't. People respond to incentives more than ideas,
And
basically.
this is exactly why I said in the on the first segment that we need to think about our values
Mm.
and to have a very pluralistic approach towards them.
I wouldn't say pluralistic. I think we need a unidirectional cultural movement towards something more wholesome. And
Well, you are saying something more wholesome, but
yes,
what you understand as wholesome presumably involves a lot of values in it.
yes, but it's not pluralistic across multiple value traditions. It's one umbrella value tradition with multiple values contained within it, right? Because multiculturalism is untenable. You can
No,
have
I agree it
yeah,
is.
exactly. You
I
can
agree it is, but okay, that's semantics for now. Let's leave that.
well, yeah, okay. And I just thought I'd finish on this. So there's a Twitter thread which was quite interesting that just looks at the maps of below and above replacement birth rates. And on this, it decides to point out, and comes back to the pluralism idea, that one of the leading countries is Israel in terms of its birth rates. And the reason is they have a strong religious conviction for preferentially wanting children. So without that core value, if your society succumbs to antinatalism or just value neutral material generation, then if you only exist to keep generating wealth for yourself and you only think about yourself and you don't have a metaphysical commitment that privileges things over just what you can register on a spreadsheet, then you can't mount a defense for the family as the primary mode of social and civic engagement, insulated from the political and manufacturing realm. And so I just think that we need a values revitalization that then spearheads an economic transformation that allows men to start being single income earners for their family again to try and reverse this demographic decline. But until then, the country will become far more Indian, Pakistani over the future. And I think our culture will be gradually erased and economics will become untenable. And so I think we should probably change that before it's too late. If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, why not visit our website where you can get the podcast live, in full, uncensored, and for free from 1 o'clock UK time every weekday. And while you're there, for as little as £5 a month, you can get access to all of our premium content. For example, Dan's series Brokenomics, where he and Carl discuss the observable managed decline in our civilization. And if you'd like to see what the rest of us are putting out, you can follow Dan at KingBingo underscore on Twitter and at Lotus Eaters underscore com on Twitter. Until next time, goodbye.